go ahead, please.
Oh, Mike.
Introduce our speaker, Dr. Rob Butler.
Okay, thank you. I thought I could make this really fast because Audrey did an absolutely wonderful job of providing an overview of all of Rob's academic qualifications, his fellowships, his board memberships, his contributions to scientific and popular audiences through articles, television appearances, radio interviews, and speaking engagements. And she also included a link to his nature culture website. But I just realized we have a number of new members here and people who are not members who won't have seen the newsletter. So I will have to backtrack a little bit here and go through a few of these things. I'll try not to take too much time because you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to Dr. Butler. Anyway, Rob has spent about a half a century being involved with the conservation of nature and has now come to a unifying vision of nature and human culture, which he calls nature culture. And if you go onto his website, you will find a link to that. Those of you who have access to the newsletter, you'll find a link to that website right there. Rob has a number of degrees, including a master's degree in science, a PhD. He's a fellow of the Explorers Club, the Royal Canadian Geographic Society, pardon me, and the American Ornithologists Society. He's an outstanding alumnus of Simon Fraser University and Capilano University, and he's also a signature member of Artists for Conservation. And that was an organization I hadn't even heard about until Joanne Van Snellenberg gave me a calendar this year. And I'm looking at this calendar and I see people like Robert Bateman, but then I also see Rob Butler, which is very interesting. For someone to be one of the most respected and consulted ornithologists in Canada is one thing. To be an author, a well-known speaker and an artist on top of that is really quite something. So I won't go on and on here, but one of the things I did want to mention, and I don't think it was in the newsletter, is that there was a new book released in 2020 called Pacific Flyway, which Rob co-authored with Audrey Benedict and Jeff Hamerson. And that book is about the migration of birds along the Pacific coast of the Americas. Obviously a subject of keen interest to those of us who are sitting here living under the specter of Roberts Bank Terminal 2. So that is something that I'm sure everyone will be interested in checking out. Research, has included the social behavior of crows, a subject on which he's an ecology expert. So I was really happy when he agreed that he would do a presentation on crows tonight. So tonight's presentation is called Crows Around Town. And I'll ask Rob to pick that up in a second. As mentioned earlier in the meeting when not everyone was here, Rob has asked that questions be held until after the presentation. If you want to use the chat function to record your questions, please go for it, or just make a note so that you can ask them later. And I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, Rob.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, it is great to be here. It's always fun to talk about crows and talk to naturalists. You guys are the greatest people on the planet because you're interested in nature. So that's always good. Yeah, what I wanted to talk about today is that, as Elizabeth said, I've been working on crows and other birds for half a century now, which seems unbelievable to me. But and what I thought I would address tonight is how the crow went from being a pariah to being the poster child of bird conservation and around the city. There's been a fundamental change in the 50 years that I've been studying them. And I want to address some of that. But first, before we get into that, I'd like to just talk a little bit about who is the crow, or what is the crow. As some of you may know, the Northwestern crow is the crow that's along our coastline. It's historically been, its range has included Puget Sound up along the British Columbia coast into Alaska. So it's a different species than the crow that's found all across North America. Well, about a year ago, a student down at University of Washington did some genomic work on it and showed that they deeply hybridize, particularly here around Vancouver and a few other locations. And the American Ornithological Society that rules on this, on the taxonomy, had said that the Northwestern crow was just a hybrid, a mix of the American crow, and it was no more. So if you have a look at that, you'll see in many of the bird checklists, it's disappeared entirely. So anyway, I had a look at the data that this student had put together for his thesis and published, and I think I have a little different interpretation. I mean, he's done a great job to show that indeed they do hybridize. It's what ornithologists have thought about for a long time, particularly here around Vancouver. But many of the other places up the coast is probably where American crows kind of seep out through the coastal valleys onto the west coast and then hybridize with some of the Northwestern crows. There's a vast area along our outer coast in Haida Gwaii that haven't been sampled yet. And up in Alaska, he found that they were largely pure Northwestern crows. Well, the American Ornithologists Society had decided that, they had made a bit of a mistake to start with, and they decided that they would make it into a subspecies. And so that's where it is today. So now I have another paper coming out, hopefully, maybe we'll see. We'll restore it. It'll be back again as ours. Now, this species is really a British Columbia species with a little bit of coverage up into Alaska as well. And it's really one that appears to be associated with the rainforest, which is sort of interesting. It's really a British Columbia species. And it may be that this thing has evolved here over time, just on the coast. The thought is that during the Ice Age, that there was a refugia, a place where there was no ice around Haida Gwaii. The water, sea level was lower, much lower than it is. And the area off Hackett Strait appears to have been uncovered, not covered in ice. It was actually forested and probably quite similar to what it is like today. And they think that the crow and maybe several other species remained isolated for thousands and thousands of years in that little pocket of among the ice. And of course now, as the ice melted, the two species come back together and they're starting to breed again. So we do have around Vancouver and on Vancouver Island, clearly hybrids. And so the crows we're looking at are really a hybrid species of crow, but that doesn't really matter to us, does it? A crow is a crow, so we all love them. But I thought you'd be interested if you're into birds, that maybe we will get the Northwestern crow back as a full species. We'll have to wait and see. So that's our crow. So how did it go then from this being this pariah to being this very, very popular species around us? Well, I think a lot of it had to do with the science. It's scientists studying the crows, some of the other species. There's about 45 species, a little bit more around the world. And there are other species on some of the remoter islands and in different parts of the world where scientists have been studying their behavior. And I think you've probably seen many of those reports. Some of them have been on the Nature of Things. You've probably read about them, probably seen them on YouTube and their ability to solve problems. The thought is that they're probably around their intelligence and problem solving is probably about similar to a 7-year-old child. So they're pretty clever. And if you really want to know a lot more about crows, what I suggest you do is pick up John Marsliff's book. This is the one here. It's called Crows and Ravens. And it was published by Yale University Press. And he has in here a load of information on all of these things about the intelligence of the crows and what people have learned about them. It's an excellent book. John Marsliff is a professor from the University of Washington. It's very readable. And if you're interested in crows and ravens, you'll love that book. It's great. So in terms of the intelligence, one of the things they've discovered is that crows do have large brains for the size of their bodies. And the ratio, the kind of the proportion of the brain size to the body size is somewhat equivalent to the brain size and body size of the great apes. So some people have said, well, really, all crows are is just feathered apes. They're as clever as the apes, they just happen to have feathers. And you've probably also heard about this idea of if you call somebody that they have a bird brain, that they're not very intelligent. And that's a concept that arose back in about 1920s, 30s, when when people were starting to study the brains, particularly the mammalian brain. And they looked at the bird brain and they said, you know, the frontal lobes where we do most of our rational thinking and problem solving just doesn't exist in birds. So, you know, birds, they're just like robots. They really aren't very intelligent. There was no analysis of any of this. This was just, you know, some bad press for the birds. Well, more recently, people have been starting to look at this, and particularly when you look at crows, you realize, hey, you know, these crows are actually very intelligent, but they don't have those frontal lobes. It's just that the crows and birds in general evolved from dinosaurs so much earlier than mammals, from the ancient reptiles, that the brain is just wired differently. And I like the way that one of the scientists said, if you compare the mammalian brain to the bird brain, it's like the Mac and the PC. They're wired completely differently, but they both operate perfectly well. They're just very, very different the way they operate. And so all kinds of studies have gone on looking at birds and looking at the intelligence of them. And they found, you know, parrots are exceptionally clever at solving problems, but the crows are right up there too. And I really suggest you just, when you know you don't have much time or you have lots of time in the evening, go onto YouTube and just look at some of those studies with the New Caledonian crow and some of the problem solving things that they've given them, some of the challenges. It's just absolutely astounding to see what they're capable of doing. One thing we do know from John Marsliff's work is that the crows recognize each other, and they also recognize you. And what happens is if you treat them badly, they'll remember this and they'll tell their young, and their young will know that you're a bad person, even though you may not have done anything to them. Their parents told them this, and it's passed on. And I've heard anecdotally from some people up on Cortes Island that it's up to a couple of generations now, that long ago, one of their parents mistreated a crow, and that crow passed it on to their young, and they've passed it on to the next generation. And they still harass her when she comes out. This is, you know, many, many years later. So they do remember this, and they do remember the faces. And John Marsliff, using some very creative things, using some gorilla masks and so on, tested all of this out down on the campus in Seattle, and showed indeed that they do remember who you are. So this is one of the things I think that has really turned the tide for the crow, is that people seem to like animals that are intelligent. So that seems to be one of the things in their favor. But one of the other ones that came along was, I'm sure you've heard about Canuck the Crow. And Canuck was a crow that was a young nestling that Sean Bergman managed to raise when he, as a nestling, raised it all the way through, and then he let the crow grow. And the crow hung around in East Vancouver and got involved in all kinds of antics. And he started a Facebook page, and I think when I last looked at it, there were 50,000 followers following Canuck. And during one of the incidents, Canuck seemed to hang around this McDonald's up on Hastings Street. And there was an incident there with a schizophrenic person who had a knife, and ended up, the police were called, and the knife was apprehended from the person, dropped onto the ground. And Canuck swooped down, picked up the knife, and ran off with it, flew off with it. And of course, this is the evidence that they needed. Sean saw this story about this crow had carried off the knife, and he knew exactly who it was. He knew it was Canuck. He raced home, and they managed to get the knife back. And this story just went viral and was picked up by the media all around the world. And so all these antics that Canuck was up to, people were following from all over the world. He used to get onto SkyTrain and ride, between the stations. You get on people's cars, perch on the mirror, and ride with them, and ride inside the car. I saw Canuck. I went over to see him. We did a little film with Telus and Sean, and he came over and landed on my shoulder and decided it'd be kind of fun to pull up my jugular. And he's a bit of a scallywag. We gave him some things. One of the things we gave him was, I thought he'd like this. This is the button from Bird Week in Vancouver. And in Vancouver, some of you may know, we've been running Bird Week now for 10 years. We decided it'd be kind of fun to have a contest, for a few years, to choose the bird that will represent Bird Week the next year. And when we first did it, we thought if we put the crow on there, it will win hands down, because we know crows are very popular. So we decided that we would just say that the crow has won the first year. And then from then on, we could just choose other ones. It ended up the next year, black-capped chickadee, after 700,000 votes, won. It was 10 times what the mayor got. So the city realized, the birds are crazy. People are really crazy about birds. And the crow, we know, is extremely popular. Jason McElroy at CBC did a fun thing looking at a little unofficial poll in which he was looking for the ambassador for Vancouver. And he had people like Michael J. Fox and Sarah McLachlan and Trevor Linden and all these other famous people, Michael Bublé and Canuck the Crow. And you know who won? Canuck the Crow. So we know that crows are very, very popular. So this has been a wonderful turnaround for the crow, and many other species have gone through the same sort of thing. Bears and wolves, they were all maligned for a long time, and then there was the attitudinal change. And again, it's the same thing where the science started to answer those kind of questions about what these animals are up about and what they do. And we find out in species like the crow, very intelligent, very social, and very, very interactive with us. I think there's a certain parallel to us as well. We are an intelligent animal, at least we like to think we are. And there's some side to the crows that's a bit on the dark side, and I think people kind of enjoy that. You see there's a whole sort of cult following around this, following the crow. If you go online, you'll see this. There's a whole group of people that do this. So I do talks on this, on the crow, and the last one I did was with the Vancouver Foundation and Vancouver Institute, and there were 750 people that came out to that. It was an overflow crowd. They just want to know about crows, and everybody has a story about them. So I'm hoping that you will do some of this for me tonight, maybe on some of your questions and things. Tell me a few of the stories if you've interacted with crows. And, they're always fun because it seems like everybody has a story about them. So one thing around the city with our crows is that we have a lot of crows around the greater Vancouver area. I'm not sure out in Delta where all of your crows go for the night, but the ones in Vancouver go to a big roost in Burnaby off Still Creek Drive, which is just near BCIT. And if you want to have a lot of fun, go down just around sunset and watch that. You're going to see 10 to 15,000 crows descend on the trees. And they come in there in these hordes, huge numbers, and they're all over the ground calling. And it's an unbelievable event to witness. It's a real spectacle that all of us should see. They do the commute out along the SkyTrain at the same time that people are commuting out of the city. And people always ask, where are those crows all going? Well, they're all going to that one particular roost. If you park your car there at the McDonald's down on just off Willingdon, you'll be almost in the center of the roost. They're along Still Creek Drive, right in the light industrial area, all up in the trees. They'll come in these huge numbers, and then all of a sudden it just goes silent. And you have no clue that there's even a crow there. And there's 10,000 of them in all the trees. They will rustle and so on as you walk by, but you wouldn't even know they were there. It's absolutely silent. In the morning, they just reverse it and off they go. And they go and come from as far away as Port Moody, from North Surrey, from North Richmond, all of Vancouver and North Vancouver. They all descend on that one location. And I'm thinking that there's probably a roost out where you are. I've heard some stories or some hints that there might be one out towards Serpentine Fen or somewhere in that area. Maybe one of you knows where this is. There's also one up the valley up near Langley. And there's big roosts down in Seattle and around in the whole Puget Sound area. So we're very fortunate to have these. So that's what the crows are doing in the wintertime, going to and fro these roosts. When they come back in the morning, they're going back to their territories where they will nest. And you'll see pairs of crows now sitting on these the tops of trees. Then they fly to the ground, feed mostly along the grass on the ground, looking for insects and whatever, any kind of roadkills or anything like that. And then when the flocks start to come back in the evening, they go back to the roost. This goes on until sometime in about March. At that time, they start to get twigs and start to build nests. They will still go down to the roost while they're building the nest, but as soon as the eggs are laid, the crows will be roosting in your yard. And all of us have them. I have many of them just around where I live. keeping track of all the nests. They're probably less than half a kilometer apart. And so there's lots of them, and they do very well. Some of them have helpers. These are young from the previous year. They have a kind of a brownish cast to the feathers. And the ones that have the helpers do better than the ones that don't, because obviously they're helping. So it's not easy, I think, for crows to find an open nest site. They're all full. And so these helpers are hanging around with mom and dad, hoping that, maybe there'll be a spot next door, or be able to find a place. And in the meantime, they can help raise the next year's young, which is kind of cool. So the crows will lay about 4 or 5 eggs. Female incubates them, and the male hangs out nearby, just keeping an eye open. And when they hatch out, they keep pretty quiet. And I've noticed that there's been a lot of depredations from eagles. You were talking about that earlier, all the eagles that are around. The eagles are flying over, keeping an eye on the crows, looking for the nests. They have great eyesight. They can pick those nests out pretty fast. Red-tailed hawks will do the same thing, ravens. And so I'm noticing the crow nests are coming down lower and lower. But if they get down too low, then they get hit by the raccoons. So they're trying to find that even kind of balance. And most of them in the city don't do very well because of this. It's wide open. There's just scattered trees, and they don't do very well. So some of John Marsliff's work shows that many of the recruits are coming from the countryside. So out where you are in Delta, you might be producing the crows that are coming into Vancouver. So the crows are doing well. There's lots of them around, and we're very fortunate to have them. Like I say, that book of John's would be a great one to get and read up a little bit more about the crows. One last thing I should mention is that often you'll hear about crows attacking people in the late summer, and that they're not really attacking you. What they're doing is they have young out of the nest, and the young will leave when they're not really great flyers, and they're just being great parents looking after their young. And they're just trying to move you on, and that will last for maybe a week or two, just trying to get you away from their young ones. So they're just good parents. That's all they're doing, and then they'll move on. There are some videos you'll see on YouTube of some of the crow fights that are really vicious, and that's the dark side of the crows. You might want to watch those. Not sure. But the thing that I really like to see about with these crows is just how our attitude toward them has changed. And we should think about this with all these animals. We're starting to see a change in attitudes towards sharks. I think snakes and spiders and still have a way to go. But I think we need to really start thinking differently about these and realize how lucky we are to have these animals around us. And what I'm trying to encourage through this idea of a nature culture is to find ways to express this, that when you go out and you see things like this and you really are moved by it, is there something that you can do to express that really love of nature and make it part of your life and part of who you are? We try to do this with Bird Week, provide the stage for people. And we did that through the International Bird Festival in 2018, brought people from all around the world. And we said, we have the stage. And if you have something you want to address and talk about birds, whether your interest is in music or if it's in dance or if it's in food or whatever it is, just come and be part of this. And let's make a culture that's responding to nature. You come to it in all different ways. So choose the one that best suits you and try to find a way to celebrate it. We are going to be holding Bird Week again this year. We're going to change it to the Vancouver Bird Celebration and align with Toronto that calls it the Toronto Bird Celebration. And we're looking to expand this. As I think you probably remember, we'd hoped this year that we would be able to have 10 more municipalities join us for the Greater Vancouver Bird Celebration. And you were going to be part of it. Delta was part of it. So was Burnaby and North Vancouver and many other municipalities. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way. Our plan this year will be to do quite a few things online, but there will be lots of really fun things going on as well, all around birds. And we're trying to reach out to all new audiences, offering things in different languages and to different marginalized groups. So we're trying to expand and make it as much fun as we can. And I think that's the key in all of this, in the bird celebration, is there's lots of things in the environment that you can worry and fret about, but there's time when you can have fun and really enjoy it. And if you do that, then other people will join you and we can really make it into something really great. So the crow has been part of that whole story. Hopefully we'll have lots more stories to come, lots more antics around crows. But I think for now, I'd like to turn it over to you, and maybe we can answer some questions. I see there's about 10 of them on the chat here. And if you have some stories about crows, let me know. I'm always keen on those. I'm thinking about doing a book on this, on crows. So if you can, maybe we'll turn it over to Elizabeth. And if you've got some questions, just fire away. I'm here all day or all night.
Okay, there are some comments on the chat thing, but there are also a few questions. Annie Cap's last question is quite interesting. Do they have funerals?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. There have been, again, John Marsland's got a student who's been looking at this, and they've been talking about this for quite some time. This is where a crow dies and other crows gather around it, and it looks like they're going through some kind of mourning or some kind of, they're not quite convinced that that's really what it's about. It may be more trying to learn from what happened. Why did that one die? And, you know, to be safe and try to avoid this. They think there may be more, it may be more related to that. I have heard anecdotes of crows that have, where one of the mates has died and the other one has just called and called and called as if it's, you know, calling out. What that actually means, whether it's mourning or whether it's looking for another mate, you don't really know. But, you know, I think we have just started to scratch the surface of these crows and what's going on. I see things around here at home in which we have a pair of crows, and if you put a peanut out for one of them will come down, but the other one will not do it. It won't come down to the food. And there's something going on. There's some sort of deeper thing, like you don't touch that. It's not mine, I don't touch it. And these are things we really don't know much about. And the funerals is another one where you really don't know for sure, but that's the fun about them. They're mysterious, and there's always things to learn.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Sharon Jones. In the Smithers, BC area, the locals refer to their large crow as a raven. Is it actually a raven or is it a crow?
Well, they have both. Throughout British Columbia, we have both. The raven is much, much larger, has a wedge-shaped tail. That's the really distinctive thing that you can see when they fly over. And they have that croaking call, and very large bills. They tend to cover large, vast areas, almost like a hawk would do. So they'll travel long distances. And you can usually tell when a raven goes by because there's a whole party of crows escorting it out. They're their arch enemy. So that's the way to tell them apart. And up there, they'll have both, but we have them right here too. And the ravens are starting to move back into the city now. They're nesting under the bridges and really putting a run on some of the crows. So that would be another a bit of pressure on them on their nesting success. But there is a great book on the raven as well called The Mind of the Raven by Bernard Heinrich. He had captive ravens, and he did a lot of work on the interactions between them. So if you're into crows, that's another great book to get.
Okay. Now, David and Noreen were asking about the two sizes of crows locally. Are these just variations, or are they related to the Northwestern crow and American crow?
Okay, I mean, that's an interesting question. First of all, there's the raven and the crow. So we have both of those. That might be what you're referring to. You might see those differences. The measurements of the Northwestern crow indicates that it is smaller than the American crow, but it's very subtle. I studied the Northwestern crow on Middle Natch Island 50 years ago. And those were, as far as I know, Northwestern crows. And I did notice when I came back to Vancouver how big the crows were here. Of course, we now know that they're hybrids. So the hybrid is somewhere in between. And if you go, over east of the Coast Range, where there's just American crows, they're bigger again. So, but it is very subtle.
Okay. There's another question from Annie, which is considered more intelligent, the crow or the raven?
Oh, measuring intelligence is always a dangerous thing to do. Generally, what they do is give them a set of problems, and you see how they solve them, how quickly they're able to solve them. I don't know any that have compared ravens to crows, but both of them are very, very, very clever. And if you read some of the work of Bernard Heinrich, you'll see just how clever they are. I think the crows might even outsmart us. I'm just joking, but I want to tell you a funny story. The crows are related to the jays and magpies and the raven. They're all in the corvid family, not the COVID, the corvid family. And many of the jays store their food. So our jay here, the Stellar's jay, it will take acorns and store them, and they forget where some of them are, and then those will sprout and become oak trees. The pinyon pine does a lot of this, storing a lot of pinyon pines. This is one that's down in the US Rockies. And they've done work on some of these jays to see how good they are at locating their food. Like our crow does the same thing. If it gets a large piece of food, it'll take it off and cache it and come back, usually within 24 hours. So they wanted to see with these jays that are storing these seeds all over. The concept is that, when there's seeds in the summer, they store them all, and then there's snow. The snow comes and covers them over, but the jays still dig down through the snow and find them. How do they do that on a snowbank? So they did some experiments where they took a big trailer and filled it with kitty litter, and then they gave the seeds to these jays, and they went off and stored them. And the experimenters kept track of exactly where those seeds were stored. And then they let the jays back, and they watched, and they were able to find them days later in a completely uniform area of kitty litter. So, being creative scientists and just answering this question about how intelligent they are, they got some of the grad students and they asked the graduate students to go out and do the same thing and bury the seeds. And then they asked them to come back and find them the next day. Well, they weren't as good as the jays. And the surprising thing is that many of these jays can remember where they are weeks later and maybe even months later where they have stored them. So they have this memory bank. They found now recently with black-capped chickadees who do the same thing. If you watch them, they're taking seeds from your feeder and storing them, that they actually have it's sort of like a plan in their brains, like a map, where all these things are stored, and you can just call them up. At the end of the breeding season, all of this is just downloaded off, they clean the computer, and the whole thing is rewired for the next year. And this is part of the way that they remember where they are. It's really fascinating when you delve into this.
Oh, Anita wanted to know, did Canuck ever return?
No, we don't know what happened. I have no idea. Canuck just disappeared. Hard to really know. The crows, they will get picked off by predators, and maybe that's what happened. The eagles and red tails, but particularly eagles will take them. Great horned owls will take them. It could have been that. Hopefully it's not something more nefarious, but we will probably never know.
Okay, there's a question from Cheryl. Since COVID started and many of our patterns of street traffic and people congregating have changed, has there been a change in the patterns of crows as well?
Well, that's an interesting question, because crows are what we call a commensal. They're all close to people. I mean, if you go more than about 5 kilometers away from town, you don't find crows. You go up in the mountains, you don't find them. They're just around us. And that seems to be the case all across North America. They seem to really do well around us. I haven't noticed any big change, or I haven't noticed any changes really in their patterns, what they're doing. I'll tell you a fun story. Is the crows are able to count, as you probably know, and on garbage day, the crows will come out expecting that there might be something spilled, and they seem to have a mental idea that every 7 days is garbage day, and they appear. My wife pointed this out to me, that we get a holiday and it gets delayed by a day. The crows appear the day before, they're looking. They're like, well, where's the garbage? That's 7 days. But because of the holiday, it was now at 8 days. So the crows seem to be able to keep track of all of this, and so they may be more clever than we think.
Okay, there's more questions from Annie. What is their natural food?
Well, Crows are, their bill is like a Swiss Army knife. It can be used in all different situations. And so they will feed on pretty much whatever they can find in the local area. So here around the city, the diet studies that have looked at it has been predominantly insects, followed by some roadkills and things. People often think that they take birds' eggs and young, and they do if they're given the opportunity. But it appears that the jay, particularly the Seller's jay, is far more effective at finding them because the jays skulk around in the undergrowth far more than the crows. So the crows will take them if you give them a chance, but they didn't find a huge amount in their diet. When you go out to the outside coast, or even here around Vancouver, you'll see some of them going after clams, getting clams and dropping them on rocks and cracking them open. They'll get small crabs that they find underneath rocks. They'll turn them over. They look for fish, they turn over the seaweed, find the small fish, and so on. With the clams, it's sort of an interesting story. So here's the problem for you if you're a crow. If you get a clam and you have to drop it on a rock, how high should you fly to do that? What's the most efficient height? And Howie Richardson actually looked at this. This is a student from Simon Fraser. And what he found is that if you drop them too low, they won't crack open. And if you fly too high, you'll crack them open, but the other crows will steal them. So there's a place in between, which is just sort of perfect. Just fly up, drop, crack. And it takes a long time for them to learn this. The yearling crows, the ones who are teenagers, aren't very good at it. They lose them, or they don't crack them open. He also looked at where crows have been doing this for years and years, dropping these clams, and of course they leave the shells. So he looked at the size of the shells that they cracked open and then compared them to the ones that were on the beach. And he found that the crows don't take the small clams, as you might expect, because there's not enough meat in them. So he calculated it out that the size where they start to take them is where it actually is worth their while to spend the time looking for it, carry it to the rocks, drop it open, and get the food up. They can do this calculation in their head that they're going to get enough food energy from that clam to do it. So what he did is he experimented with it by actually providing them with the clams, and they would shift down a size category. Then he provided where he actually cracked them open for them and they shifted down again. And he was able to show this, that the crows are able to make that calculation that this is too small, it's not worth my while. I won't even go after it. So they're very, very good at this. This whole thing of cracking things open, the cracking clams, dropping them on the rocks. There's a parallel study to this in Japan where they noticed the crows were dropping nuts onto the road, cracking them open. And many years ago, one of the crows discovered that if they left it in the traffic and the cars ran over it, the car would crack it open. And so the crows, what they do is they wait for the light to change, and they go put the nut out there, and then they sit on the wire and wait for the cars to go back and forth. The light changes again, goes red, they go down and pick up the nut. So they've learned how to do this, and it's spreading across Japan. So it's a cultural transmission. This is not inherited. This is something that they're learning, and they're learning from one another. There is also some work on I think it's a game with the New Caledonian crow. They use the little twigs, and they've taken some of these. I think the Hawaiian crow, they've done it as well, where they've actually provided them with twigs, although they have never used the twig to get pieces of food. They've tested this out, and the crow figures this out very quickly. You get the little twig, and there's one that's the right size. Use that to pry the piece of food out. So they watch each other, they learn how to do it. And in the case of the Caledonian crows, they actually have a special length of leaf that they find most effective, and they carry it around with them, just like a little tool. This is perfect. And when they find a grub, they just use this to pry them out. So yeah, the crows are endlessly fascinating.
Okay, I'm not sure who Kay Kilbride is, but Kay Kilbride wants to know how long do they live, and do ravens live longer?
Well, if a crow becomes an adult, it will likely live for upwards of a dozen, maybe 15 years in the wild. Somewhere around there would be about right. A little longer in captivity. There's very high mortality among the young ones. A young crow, I'm not sure what the mortality, I'd have to look at that again, but it's probably 75–80% of them die in their first year. So the first year, all birds, is really tough, but if you get through that, then you have a pretty good chance. And ravens, I'm not sure how long they live, but being a larger bird, they undoubtedly live quite a bit longer than the crow.
Anita's still worried about Canuck and Cassiar. She wants to know if Cassiar has found a new mate, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, I don't know. Cassiar is the mate of Canuck, and they did have some young who tried and were somewhat successful. I don't know. I haven't talked to Sean for a while. I'll have to do that and just see. The last thing I heard that she hadn't, but that was quite a long time ago. Maybe one of the viewers here knows more about it than I do, but I'll have to get back in touch with them and find out.
Okay, thank you. We have some comments here too. Jim Ronbach said he had a raven fly down to his deck and start to untie his shoelaces. It was very friendly and would hang around for a couple of weeks to eat suet. He also perched on my arm. When the heavy rains came, it flew away and never came back. Is this normal behavior for a raven, or was it trained by someone?
It wouldn't be normal behavior, and that's exactly what I was thinking. It probably was a young bird that somebody had raised and then let it go. I've had lots of reports of that, people who have raised them for a period of time and then let them go on their own, and they do become very familiar with people. So that's probably what happened. But that's pretty amusing.
Okay, Brian Avant. You mentioned Jay stashing food and remembering where. Is that common amongst crows? I've watched a crow stash food in a lawn, tuck an aspen leaf on top and tamp it down, then step back and survey the result. It seems it then decided it was not well enough hidden, removed the leaf and retrieved the food and moved it about a meter away and repeated the hiding process.
Yeah, crows do this regularly. So if there's a surplus of food, they will do that. And in the case of when we were watching them feeding on clams, if they got an exceptionally large clam, they would do that, put it aside, and go back and get it usually on the high tide. One of these things that this does, just think about this, that if a crow is capable of doing this, storing this food, they must have some sort of sense of the future. They must know that maybe in the future I'm not going to have the food and I'm going to put it aside. Most birds don't do this. There's only a few that actually store food. And so they probably have a sense of this, of the past and the future, which is sort of interesting. There have been some studies, I think they're in that book by Bernard Heinrich on the ravens, in which a raven stores the piece of food in the cage and he realizes that the other ones are watching. And so when the others are distracted and doing something else, it moved the food. And that could be what took place here, is the crow looked around and saw another crow and thought, I'm going to move it. Or maybe it just wanted to find a better place to hide it.
In the bad old days when I used to feed squirrels and birds and whatever in Stanley Park, I would feed peanuts to the squirrels, and I'd give the peanuts to the squirrel would take it and bury it, and the crow that had been following me would immediately go and grab the peanut. This happened all the time. They were very smart. They knew exactly what to do.
Yeah, the squirrels aren't too clever about this. They probably wonder what happened. But the same thing happens with the jays. But the jays are very clever, and the jays are watching the crows. They get chased by them as well if they've got a peanut or some sort of food. And we've seen jays where they take the peanut out of the shell and hide the peanut because it's smaller rather than the one in the shell. It'd be more difficult for the crows to get. And they put them in places. The jays, of course, will come down onto the ground, and the crows are reluctant to do it. So by storing it down on the ground near where we live, gives it a little bit of safety. But there is this dynamic between the jay and the crow all the time. So it's kind of fun to watch.
There are a few comments here, not questions, but Kate Payton saying that there are over 500 bald eagle nests in Fraser Valley, Lower Mainland, and she's been watching some of them on Hancock Wildlife, and it's interesting. And she's quite right; it is very interesting to watch those cams. I have done that in the past as well. Yeah,
they are lots of fun, and it's a real good news story, because years ago when we first did the sort of review of birds here on the Fraser, I think we had 3 or 4 nests, and now they're all over the place. And the eagle has recovered, as you probably know, across, or is recovering all across North America. And so what's happening is that for 20 or 30 years, when there were very few eagles around, most of their prey had sort of the, the life of Riley. They could go and live where they want, feed wherever they want. But now the eagle is back. It's putting the run on them. And you'll see them down in Boundary Bay doing this. So they, when the peregrine falcon comes back in the late summer, they like to hunt ducks. The eagles are busy, of course, out on the salmon streams. But once the salmon runs out, the eagles, as you know, come down particularly to the delta, and they steal the ducks off the peregrine. So then the peregrine goes after the dunlin because they can get away. These are smaller birds. And so this whole thing on the predation of dunlin is all dictated by how strong the salmon run is, up the coast. It's really quite amazing, this whole connection. And one of the things we discovered in Boundary Bay is that for some of the birds, western grebes and some of the diving ducks, it appears that they move offshore when the eagles come. And so there's big flocks of grebes way out in St. Amo Bay, starting in about October, November. We used to see them closer in. So think of this if you're doing a count, a survey, and all of a sudden those numbers go down and you think the population has declined. It may be just that they're redistributing themselves because of the presence of these birds of prey. And now all across North America, this is taking place with the eagles. And we're starting to see a reassortment and a new world order starting to establish.
Okay, there's something here from Dee, and I'm not sure who Dee is, but it's one of the funniest stories I've heard about Raven was on CBC's Arthur Black CBC's Arthur Black years ago, where a raven dropped a frozen piece of dog turd on a hiker's head early in the morning. I suspect just because he was bored.
Well, I haven't seen quite the same as that, but I did watch it in Hawaii where there was an eagle with a fish, came and landed on the tree, and the raven flew up above it, went over and picked off pieces of moss and then walked back and dropped them onto the eagle. And kept doing this. After about 3 or 4 of them, the eagle finally took off. But this could be a fairly common thing, get them to drop their prey. So, ravens are very clever. But, that's a great story.
Okay, and Valerie has a comment here. Thank you so much for championing, I can't say that word, the Northwestern crow. I was upset when they delisted it. To me, it was like saying because Homo sapiens all have Neanderthal genes, we are all Neanderthals.
Yeah, I mean, this is all part of taxonomy, and this is how we as scientists go about identifying species and all this. So I mean, it is a different sort of universe for all of this. Birders get upset for some reason. Some of them said, "Thank goodness it's gone," because it's so difficult to tell them apart. Others lamented it, and we'll see what they have to say, about our crow. But like I say, regardless of that, we have a coastal crow that we can always enjoy and enjoy their antics.
Okay, so comment here from Stephanie. I have seen or heard of crows stealing cat and or dog food by one crow luring the cat or dog away and the others swooping in when the cat or dog is distracted. Other times they seem to just like tormenting dogs. Is this common crow behavior?
Yeah, I've seen it in seabird colonies where they do the same thing, where there's a food remain that's left over, where gulls are defending their nest and they've dropped some food. So they'll fly in and grab the tail of the gull, and one of them will work one angle and the other from the opposite side until they finally get it. So yeah, they work in pairs. That's fairly common to see that. Going after the dogs and things, it may be to sort of move them on, but it could be playful as well. I mean, crows are known to be playful. I had a pet crow when I was a kid. It was a runt in a nest, and it would have died, and so I brought it home, much to the chagrin of my mother. And I raised this crow and then let it go. And it used to go out to our dog and grab it by the tail just for no particular reason. So maybe they just do it for fun.
Okay, Annie Caps wants to know, are they monogamous, as mentioned It's Canuck and Cassiar.
Yes, they are. For many birds that are, we call monogamous through a season. And if they're successful, most birds will stay together. If they're unsuccessful, then they sometimes will switch mates. But there's lots of birds that are monogamous for a long time. It doesn't mean necessarily that all the eggs are fathered by the same father. For many of these species, when they were capable of looking at paternity, they found that even though we called them monogamous, there was a mix of eggs from different fathers in the nest. So that's very much a possibility. One of the interesting, this is a bit of a sideline, but one of the interesting things with the crows is when we were studying them over 50 years ago, we noticed that among the 4 or 5 eggs, the last one was a slightly different color often, sometimes a bit brighter, sometimes a bit greener or bluer. It was clear which one it was. And we kind of puzzled what the cause was. And in the scientific literature, they said that the female ran out of pigment. She just didn't have as much pigment after laying all those eggs. And I thought, no, I don't believe that. So we kept track of it and found out that crows are cannibals, and they fly around, and if they have a chance to steal an egg or two, they'll do it. And that's what they do, is they take those eggs. So by making this one egg stand out, you make sure that that's the one you take, and that's the last one. So the female, when she lays the egg, she starts to incubate at about the 2nd or 3rd one, and then 2 more days later, she'll have to lay the 5th one. So she hasn't put as much effort into that last one. It's sort of the heir to spare. And if she's going to lose one, that's the one that she would like to lose. And it appears that this is the case. There's a much higher probability that that egg will go than any of the others. And if you don't think this actually happens, you can do this little experiment yourself. Do it with your grandkids or your kids or your friends. Get a bag of Smarties and put them all with one color, and put one in there like a blue one that's by itself. And then you ask them to go into there and quickly grab a couple of Smarties. You'll find that the colored one, that particular one that stands out, will be taken. It just stands out and they take it. So it works for us too. We're just the same as crows after all.
There's a comment here for you, Rob, from D, is of the D and Brian Keating group here in Calgary, enjoying your show. Keep up the great work, and thanks to DNS.
Oh, great. Yeah, Dee and Brian and I go back a long, long way. Brian and I were actually with the Canadian Wildlife Service in the interpretation program. Oh, so long ago, I can't even remember. But yeah, it's great. So great to see you guys.
It's nice to have that little mystery solved. I couldn't figure out who D was. Okay, Brian Avant is asking, do we know how crows recognize their mates? I have read about each having unique UV markings that perhaps they can see and we can't. Any truth to that?
I don't know in crows if that's the case, but among other birds that is the case. They do have color markings, UV markings that other birds can see. The best example is the budgerigars. If you look at them, the colors that we see are quite different than if you put a UV light on them and they're able to see that. And so they know that birds pick that up. So they have their spectra is shifted a little bit into the ultraviolet. I don't know if that actually takes place with the crows. And it's a really interesting question because the crows recognize all kinds, not just their mate, but all kinds of other crows. They probably know all their neighbors. They're probably like us, they probably recognize 150, 200 faces, something like that. And what astounds me is they recognize us as well as they recognize each other. I mean, we can recognize each other, but I can't tell one crow from another, but somehow they're able to do it. So it's quite remarkable.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions here in the chat box, but does anyone else have other questions or comments, little stories they'd like to tell Rob about their interactions with crows?
Well, what I suggested, if you do have questions at any time, you can always get in touch with me. I'm at my website is robbutler.ca, so it's easy to remember. And you can just fire away, ask me some questions. I'll try to answer them for sure. And I'd just like to close with one thing is that I'm the president of the Pacific Wildlife Foundation. This is our 40th year. And these talks that we give are part of our outreach to people. And so if you want to have a look at that, the Pacific Wildlife Foundation, you can go look at our website, see the kind of things that we're doing things all over the coast and with lots of students, and just trying to preserve our great heritage here, the natural heritage of the ocean. So you can have a look at that. And we're going to bring out some more things. We're thinking in November of having a special event, probably in Port Moody at the Inlet Theatre, in which we'll have some of the latest research on killer whales and humpback whales and some of the stuff I'm talking about tonight, some of the crow work and many other ones that we'll present there and make it a fun evening. The last one we did, we had an overflow crowd. We had to do it twice. There were so many people that came out. And so again, it'll be on our website sometime in November. And it's part of our, to thank people for all the support they've given us for the last 40 years.
Okay, thank you so much for spending the time with us this evening.
It's been fun.
It was really interesting. I hope everyone had their questions answered. And thank you. I know today when I asked you about your honorarium that you said that you are doing all of your talks free right now.
Yeah, I think it's really important for clubs, like you mentioned, Sid mentioned this, how difficult it is for you guys to just keep your clubs going, and they're very important. And so, I don't accept any money for any of them. I just want to help you out one little way I can. So it's been a fun evening, and thanks everyone who came out.
Elizabeth, it looked like Valerie had a question.
Valerie, did you have a question? Somebody, I'm not seeing.
Valerie,
you
you
have
have to
to
unmute your
unmute
phone,
yourself.
your microphone.
Beg your pardon?
Valerie has to
Yeah,
unmute
I had a
herself.
neighbor who had a Cairn dog, and she would not allow any crows in her backyard except a gimpy one. And every day she would leave 3 pieces of kibble for that crow. And then the last year of her life, I noticed that when she visited me, she didn't leave kibble in her bowl. And I asked her owner, did the crow come back this year? And she said, no. So they had a relationship, which I thought was quite interesting.
How many years was that?
It probably went on for 3, 4, 5.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, not in the winter because the crow went somewhere else, but when it came back.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, people really relate to them, relate to the crows, and I think this relationship could go back a lot longer. The American crow and the Northwestern crow diverged from its common ancestor probably about 380,000 years ago, which is about the time that modern humans started to roam the earth. So they've been around a long time and probably been associated with people for a very, very long time.
Well, it was the dog it was related to, not
Yeah,
people.
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Okay, I just have a couple of thank yous here from Kilbride and saying how very interesting it was, and from Kate Payton. And just thank you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and have a good evening, and get out and enjoy the bird chirping.